Today, we're diving into a real paradox. A country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves that has, for all intents and purposes, completely collapsed. You know, this was a place famous for its beauty pageants, its wealth. It was a symbol of what a country could be. Now, well, it's a symbol of something else entirely.
So just look at this number. On paper, this should make Venezuela one of the richest places on the entire planet. That's its proven oil reserve, the biggest anywhere. But as we're about to see, this unbelievable wealth, it turned out to be a total illusion.
Because the reality is, the country is an absolute catastrophe. The local currency, the Bolivar, it's so devalued it's basically worthless. I mean, there have been reports from local markets of people butchering cats, a truly desperate measure just to fight off starvation. And that number? That's how many people have just up and left the country in the last decade. Think about that, an exodus of almost a third of the population. It's created one of the biggest refugee crises in the world, with people scrambling for a better life anywhere they can find it.
So it all comes down to this one huge question. How on earth did this happen? How did a paradise, a country literally swimming in oil, become a failed state? Let's get into it. Let's unpack the story of this paradise lost.
Let's start with the here and now, the shocking reality of modern Venezuela. Because the environmental cost, the human cost of this collapse, it's just staggering. It's literally etched into the landscape of the country. Just take a look at Lake Maracaibo, South America's largest lake. This was the cradle of the nation's wealth. Today, it's been called an oil toilet. It's this toxic soup of crude oil from thousands of leaking pipes, raw sewage, and yet people are still fishing in these waters because they have no other food. Kids are playing on abandoned oil wells. It's a nightmare.
But, it wasn't always this way. Not by a long shot. To really understand the collapse, we've got to rewind the clock, back to Venezuela's golden era, a time when the future seemed absolutely limitless.
It's hard to even imagine, but in the mid-20th century, Venezuela was a global powerhouse. Back in the 1950s, it was the fourth richest nation on earth per capita. The capital, Caracas, was filled with modern skyscrapers, American sports cars, even a shopping center so futuristic that Salvador Dalí himself admired it. Today, those same luxury high-rises are occupied by gangs and the homeless.
So how did they get there? Well, it was foreign companies, mostly American and British, that built the industry after a massive gusher back in 1922. But over the decades, Venezuela gradually took more and more control. It co-founded OPEC to get some power back from the big oil corporations. And by 1976, it had fully nationalized its oil industry, promising to build the Great Venezuela.
But here's the thing about all that incredible wealth, all that black gold. It seemed like a blessing, but it came with this hidden trap, a poison that would slowly but surely rot the country from the inside out.
There's actually a name for this, Economists call it the resource curse. And it's this crazy paradox where having too much of one valuable thing can actually make you poorer and less stable in the long run. It just warps everything, the economy, the politics, everything.
In Venezuela, oh man, it had all the classic symptoms. When oil prices were high, the government spent money like you wouldn't believe. I'm talking about flying in breeding cows on airplanes, only for them to die in the tropical heat. They imported so much cement that ships would sit in port for so long, the cement would literally harden in their hulls. And while all this was going on, every other industry, especially farming, was just left to die. Pretty soon, the only political question that mattered was, who gets to control that fire hose of oil money?
So after decades of this wild boom and bust cycle, you had deep inequality and a lot of anger. And that set the stage perfectly for a really charismatic military officer who came along and promised to finally give the oil wealth back to the people, Hugo Chávez. This moment right here, it's just incredible. After a failed coup against him in 2002, Chavez accused the leaders of the state oil company of being behind it. So he goes on his weekly live TV show, reads out the names of the top executives, declares them fired, and then he theatrically blows a referee's whistle on live TV.
And it wasn't just those executives. In the chaos that followed, Chavez fired nearly half of the company's entire workforce. That's around 20,000 experienced professionals. We're talking engineers, geologists, managers, technicians, all of them purged and replaced with people who were loyal to him.
And you can see the impact almost immediately. I mean, just look at this chart. Look at that staggering drop in production right after the purge. This right here was the point of no return. See, the country's most valuable asset wasn't the oil in the ground, it was the people who knew how to get it out, and that expertise was destroyed, practically overnight. So what happens when you get rid of all the professionals? Well, the state oil company went from being a world-class corporation to being the regime's personal piggy bank. It just became riddled with incompetence, cronyism, and corruption on a scale that is hard to even fathom.
The collapse just followed this predictable, devastating path. First, the new, inexperienced guys couldn't maintain the complex equipment. Then, money that should have gone to repairs was just stolen. At one point, the oil company was even put in charge of importing food, which led to this massive scandal where thousands of tons of chicken and milk just rotted in the ports. And as production crashed, the government lost its only source of cash, and the whole country just began to fail.
Okay, so today, Venezuela is way more than just a failed state. It's become a chessboard for a new geopolitical great game, and it's all centered on its resources and its strategic location. You might think with all these heavy U.S. sanctions designed to stop the regime, the oil would stop flowing. But it doesn't. It gets transported by a so-called shadow fleet of tankers. These ships turn off their tracking systems or do these risky ship-to-ship transfers out at sea to hide where the oil is from. And a lot of it ends up going to China.
And this whole situation really illustrates a much bigger trend that's happening all across Latin America. For a long time, the United States was the dominant partner. But now, China has moved in, and they've moved in aggressively. China is now the key trading partner for a lot of the region, investing billions, buying up resources, and even becoming a major arms supplier to countries just like Venezuela.
So when you boil it all down, this isn't just a story about oil or one political ideology or a few corrupt politicians. It's really a profound warning. It shows what happens when a nation's greatest treasure becomes its most destructive curse, attracting predators from both inside the country and out.
And maybe the best way to sum all of this up comes from one of Venezuela's own visionaries, decades ago. Juan Pablo Pérez Alfonso, one of the co-founders of OPEC. He saw the danger of a sudden flood of oil money. His warning basically says that having too much unearned wealth can be just as deadly to a nation as having nothing at all. And that's a lesson Venezuela and the rest of us learned the hard way.